with you all. Hopefully we'll have some nice dialogue and conversations. Let's see, get into presentation mode.
Okay, so Rachel, it's 11. We can go ahead and get started if you're ready.
Yes, everyone
well,
see my screen?
I do, but the beautiful picture isn't there anymore. Oh, there it goes. Okay.
Okay, so welcome to the ACT conference. Thank you for selecting this workshop. This workshop is called Problematizing Systems for Not Students. We want to let everybody know that this workshop is being recorded. I'm pleased to introduce your speaker, Rachel Valentina. My name is Rebecca Floyd, and I will be your room monitor. So if there are any technical difficulties, let me know. In the chat, you can let me know. I'll be monitoring that. I'm also looking at the waiting room. I will drop the workshop evaluation in the chat a few minutes before the workshop concludes. And with that, Rachel, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Welcome again. I just want to thank you all for being here and sharing in community with us all. It means a lot to me to help or to facilitate this workshop with you all. And the title is Problematizing Systems, Not Students, Leaning Away from Intent and Owning Our Impact. So again, my name is Rachel Vatanya. I go by she, her pronouns. I'm the coordinator of education services for San Leandro Unified School District. I was actually born and raised in Philadelphia. So I'm from the East Coast originally. I've lived in California for about 14 years now. I've worked in education for over 15 years. And I have a child who goes by non-binary gender terms. This is a recent development. So if I share stories about them, you may hear me kind of switch back and forth between gendered pronouns and non-gendered pronouns. So this is a shift for me. I also want to state that I am presenting from the native land of the Ohlone in San Leandro, and just always wanting to honor our history and our ancestors. We're going to get started with a mindful moment because just because of the times that we're in and the fact that the work and the thinking and the discourse that we're going to be engaging in, it can be triggering and it's challenging. So I want to invite everyone to just take a moment to find a comfortable seat. And the first thing I'm going to invite you to do is to think of 3 things or people you love. And once you have those things or people in your mind, I want you to take them and hold them in your heart. And carry them in your heart with you as we continue throughout this workshop. The second thing I'm going to invite you to do is to think of 2 things that made you laugh or smile recently. And once you have those moments or things in your mind, allow that smile or that laughter to just fill you from the inside out. And carry that warmth and that feeling with you as we continue through this workshop. And then the last thing I'm going to invite you to do is to just ground yourself in taking one deep cleansing and healing breath, knowing that in this moment we are okay and we are together in community. Thank you so much for engaging in that mindful moment with me. So our virtual workshop norms, I'm just going to ask everyone if you could please keep your camera on and your mic muted. This is more important when we go into breakout spaces. I have planned for 2 breakout spaces today. So when I'm presenting in full screen, please feel free to get comfortable, turn off your camera. But when we're in those small spaces, if you could please turn your camera on and your mic muted unless you're speaking. Also, using the raise hand function when during presenting will help Rebecca address any needs that come up during the presentation as well, or using the chat feature. Rebecca will be monitoring the chat for us. And then when you're sharing, if you could please share your name when you're speaking to help us locate you in this space, that would be amazing. And then the last thing I'm going to ask is to be mindful of background distractions. So that could be noises or people or things going around that may distract us from the work that we're engaging in for the next hour or so. And then a few expectations is just if you could please stay engaged, active listening and active engagement. So again, that's more specifically for those small breakout spaces that we'll have. And then expect and accept non-closure. So agreeing to a learner stance. We're all learning and we're all growing and developing in this work. So just being patient with ourselves and with others. And then to speak your truth. We're going to keep it personal, local, and immediate. So I ask that we use I statements or start with I so that we're keeping it personal, local, and immediate. And then there are a few things that I want to also invite you to do. So be curious. When you're listening, listen for understanding. And when you're engaging, I want to invite you to engage to further discussion. Entering where you are, but also working within that stretch zone. So you're pushing outside your comfort zone and working in that stretch zone. That's the area where we start to notice and see change in our thinking and our ways of being and doing. So this workshop, we're going to isolate race. And we're going to assess our current reality for students of colors in our work environment. So if that's a school or counseling or wherever you're working, we're going to isolate race and just kind of look at the current realities for people of color in those environments. And then we're going to also own our impact. So again, as I mentioned earlier, we want to shift away from intent and we want to lean into our complicity. Like, so in what ways are we upholding systems that continue to harm and oppress our students and people of color? And then I just want to share that one of the significant implications of leaning into, well, I'll share it on the next slide. So let me finish. So one of the things that you'll notice is just like impact over intent. So impact is the outcome or effect of a behavior or action. And then our intent is the purpose or reason for doing something. And the reason we want to kind of like uplift or lean into our impact over intent is that when we're leaning in intent instead of our impact, little if anything changes. We shift responsibility onto others instead of looking at our role and the part that we play on these outcomes, these inequitable outcomes for our students of color or for people of color in our lives and in our communities. We're going to start this workshop with a quote. And then again, this lends itself to this impact over intention frame or mindset, is that when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. And a lot of times when we're talking about people and when we look at students in the classroom or individuals that we work with, if things aren't going the way that we expect them to or the way the society expects them to, we look at the person and then we pathologize the person and not the systems in which we're expecting them to flourish and develop and blossom and thrive. And flowers are a perfect example because when you plant flowers, you plant them with the intention for them to grow and develop and bloom and be these beautiful, amazing things. And we don't blame the flower for not developing into what it could be. We shift and we make changes in the environment to help it grow and thrive. So just holding on to this quote because we'll come back to this idea or this notion when we go into our first breakout space. The next few slides, we're just going to kind of ground ourselves in common terms and lens and frameworks so that when we are discussing these are using this language, we have a common understanding. So for the purpose of this workshop, race is something that is socially constructed. I believe that, but just saying that if that is not a belief that you came into this workshop with, this is the belief that we're going to hold in this space. So it is socially constructed. It's a hierarchy of human life based on skin color. It's about profit and privilege. It's invented to maintain and maintained by false biological claims to control the balance of wealth and power. So I've listed 3 types of racism, and you may have seen this divided into 4 because they add institutional ahead of systemic, but I believe that institutional and systemic kind of go hand in hand. But I just want to kind of uplift the fact that racism is a complex social and political system designed and implemented years ago, and it's upheld by to uphold white supremacy. And a lot of times when I was growing up, racism was this like blatant act of just like cruelty and hate. But racism is more than just conscious hate, and it can also show up as privilege, access, ignorance, and apathy. And the 3 types of racism that we're going to be looking at today is individual, so it's personal beliefs and actions; collective, so group expectations and norms; as well as systemic, so policies, laws, and rules. So I mentioned in the previous slide, white supremacy culture, and I'm going to ask everyone if you could just quietly to yourself to say that term, white supremacy culture. It may be triggering, but it's very real, and it's something that we need to make visible within our society and within the communities in which we exist. And the idea of white supremacy culture, or the notion as defined by the Stand Up for Racial Justice Coalition, is that white supremacy culture is the idea or ideology that white people and the ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions of white people are superior to those of Black, Indigenous people of color. And this is not just an idea or ideology that's held by whites. It's held by non-whites. It was held by me. It's something that I actively, on a daily basis, work to decenter and dismantle, because as you can see, and if you've heard of the analogy of the fishbowl, white supremacy culture is the water in which we are all swimming, and we are all getting wet. So we are all impacted by white supremacy culture. And one of the most humbling things in my life has uncovering, accepting, and challenging my complicity in sustaining white supremacy culture in my personal life and also in my professional life. So just a notion that it's not something that's just held by whites. These are some of the typical characteristics of white supremacy culture. I'm not going to read through all of them. And again, this is not something that's like concrete, that if you believe in white supremacy culture that you have all of these characteristics. You may have just a few or most. And again, this is just an overview, or like what we typically see in white supremacy culture. And one of the things I wanted to highlight with this, and if you click, once I share the PDF, I just want to let you know that there are clickable links on all of the things that I've shared. So you can click on this image and it will take you to a document that will give you more information. But one of the things I just want to quickly cover on this slide is that understanding the characteristics of white supremacy culture, it sheds light on how we consciously or unconsciously perpetuate it in the norms, standards, and policies that significantly impact people of color. So we are going to go into our first breakout space. And in that space, I want you to first take some time to kind of position yourself within that small community. So share your name. If you have pronouns that you would like to be addressed by, share those. And then I would like you to share or invite you to share about what you believe the current reality of systems are for the students of color at your site. Another question that you can consider is, what are some of the ways I witness visibility and agency being obstructed in the schools for students of color? So there are two things that you can address in these spaces. But first, if you could please just take some time to introduce yourselves, maybe even if you need some time to think before sharing. Are there any questions? I'm going to exit out of full screen just so I can see. Are there any questions around this breakout space?
How long will we have in the
So,
breakout space?
yes, thank you. That's a great question. Let me stop my screen share so I can see everyone. So you'll have about 10 minutes in the breakout space, so about 2 minutes each to share. And then we'll come into the main space and I'll ask if anyone would like to share in the chat so that we can kind of share some of the things and noticings that we're experiencing at our place of work. And I also don't want to limit it to your place of work. If it's something that you're noticing in your community, please feel free to share. These are just guiding like questions and frames. So, and invitations. Any other questions? Okay, so we're going to send you into your breakout spaces and you'll have 10 minutes. I'll see you on the other side. Thank you. Rebecca, did you set a timer for the breakout spaces or should we keep time?
I set a timer.
Awesome, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And they have the 60-second grace period for them.
Yeah, so what I'll do is right around the 2-minute mark, I'll let them know that they have 2 minutes left, and then when it closes, it automatically gives them that 60-second countdown.
Okay. So we have 3 people who are still in with us. Were they not assigned?
On their end, they have to accept they have to join on their end. So they might be having some difficulties or may have stepped away from the computer briefly.
Okay. I know some people came in a little bit later and I wasn't sure if you set up the breakout rooms before they came in.
Yeah, so there were a few people that came in late. So what I ended up doing, which is a nice feature with the breakout rooms, is you can just recreate them really quickly and it'll shuffle everybody back in. So when we had a couple people come in, I shuffled it again right before. So it looks like we've got about, it's actually pretty even. So looks like there's 4 to 5 people in every single room.
Okay, cool. Yeah. And then this is still recording. Will they edit this section out?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay.
I hope so.
Welcome back. I think everyone is back in this space. I hope that was an engaging experience for you and some rich discourse came out. I want to invite you to pop in the chat just some things that, some conversation that surfaced or ideas that came up in your small breakout group. And while you're doing that, I'm just going to continue moving And then I invite you to also just take a look at the chat to see what other groups discussed. Okay. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. So one of the things that may have come up is that education is a white space. Policies, practices, the policies and practices are based on white supremacy. A few historical markers that kind of highlight this. So in 1864, Indigenous children as young as 4 are being forced into boarding schools to be indoctrinated or to be assimilated into white culture. You have Plessy versus Ferguson, which isn't, the case wasn't initially an education case. I think it was about trains or segregation of trains or so forth. But that case was the precedent used for separate but equal schools. And then we have Brown versus the Board of Education, in which it legally desegregated schools. However, we never talk about the impact of Brown versus the Board of Education and how Black schools were the ones that were seen as deficient or not good enough, and Black and brown bodies were put into these white spaces that were harmful and unsafe for them. And then in 1994, you have Prop 87, which made it illegal for children of illegal immigrants or undocumented immigrants to attend school. And then a little bit further in 1998, you have these other propositions and laws and policies that came about that pretty much like crippled bilingual education. And then if you come to present day, you'll notice that most schools are more segregated than ever. And this is the result of de facto segregation. So white flight, redlining, and all these other systemic barriers that are leading to the segregation and disproportionate funding going into our education systems. This is another piece of information that's from the U.S. Department of Education. Approximately 80% of teacher cohorts graduating from pre-service teacher programs are white and middle-class whites. Less than 50% of public school students are white. And though most teacher education programs will offer 1 or 2 courses in social justice or multicultural education or English language learning programs, culturally responsive pedagogy, and teachers exit these programs feeling prepared to work with and support diverse student populations. Still, a majority of teachers, when they are actually in the classroom, they carry with them deficit-based beliefs. So when you ask them about poor academic achievement or performance, you'll hear the blame. Again, they're blaming the flour. They're not blaming the system, the soil, the lighting, the watering. They're not blaming those things. They're blaming the flour. So the students and the families. And some of the racialized narratives that I've heard as an educator, and you may have heard them too. So low intelligence, so lack of ability, inherent criminality. So when you see our schools, they're paying for SROs to come into our campuses and they're not paying for mental health and wellness services. That's the system pretty much saying that, oh, you're inherently a criminal, or that they're lazy or they lack motivation. I cannot tell you how many times I've heard teachers say, oh, their parents don't value education. And that's just such a damage-based narrative to have. The other narrative is just dehumanizing. When you hear the language that's used to describe our students and people of color, it's just very dehumanizing and othering. The other thing that I want to kind of uplift when we talk about education as being these white spaces, if you're familiar with, let me see, I believe it is, her name just skipped on my head, Peg McIntosh. McIntosh, and she talks about this idea of the invisible the invisible backpack of white privilege that white people carry around with them for no other reason but for the fact that they're white, and it's just these privileges that afford them. So, for instance, like for adults, it's like white people have they can go they have this privilege or comfort of knowing that no matter where they move, they won't be discriminated against for housing or for lending practices. And the same thing for students. White students are pretty much guaranteed positive representation and well-documented history of contributions to this country. They're pretty much guaranteed to be seen and treated like a child when they make mistakes or something happens at the school site. They're also pretty much guaranteed to safety and security and protection. If they call the police, they're pretty much guaranteed to walk away and go home unharmed. Whereas the racialized trauma or the invisible backpack that students and people of color carry, like our students of color, they have this adultification. So they're not seen as innocent or children or harmless. They're seen as violent or dangerous or criminals. They carry with them fear and anxiety and shame because of that. They also have this deficit-based representation, which we'll discuss a little bit later, in the curriculum. So it's like curriculum harm. Like if we're in the classroom and the only thing that we're hearing about is how our people were enslaved or how our people were massacred during wars and colonized, that's not uplifting, that's not empowering. So we're going to move into the harm of white supremacy culture. And one of the things that, or two of the things that I just really want to uplift from this is that white supremacy culture is dehumanizing, and I mentioned that on the previous slide to students of color. It devalues parts of our identity, so our culture, our language, our heritage, the contributions that we have made to this society. We hear people say, make America great again. People of color have been making America great since the beginning of time. It's just not widely shared. And then because of this toxicity, because white supremacy culture is invisible and toxic, and it murders the spirit and the culture of our babies, it hijacks the amygdala, and it puts students of color into the fight, flight, or freeze response, and it can lead to power struggles and learning loss. So it impacts that cognitive functions that our students need to be successful academically, socially, and emotionally. The next thing that we're going to kind of talk about is the weaponization of whiteness in schools. We've heard this term, I'm sure, or maybe you haven't, and I'll explain it on the next slide, but we've seen this play out in the media with Amy Cooper, and I think it's Jennifer Schultz in Oakland. So Amy Cooper is the Central Park person who called the police on an African-American bird watcher. And then Jennifer Schultz is the white lady in Oakland who called the police on a Black family who was barbecuing in the park. And so we've seen this play out in the media, and you'll notice that the patterns of weaponized whiteness is this sense of entitlement, so a feeling of inherent right, this feigned fear, so reporting or implying a safety concern, anger or retaliation, so using their authority to punish or reprimand when things don't go their way or where they're not respected or what have you. And then this notion of white fragility, so avoidance or defensiveness or taking these detours whenever issues of racial inequity come about. So these are blatant, these are overt like examples of weaponized whiteness, but in education, they're not always so apparent. And how they show up in school is in the curriculum. So these, like I said before, these damage-based narratives, the mediums in which we use to instruct our students. So are we just like putting them in front of textbooks with all of these like narrative or accounts of how they've been marginalized or enslaved or what have you? Or are we allowing them to use music, storytelling, videos, and all these other different mediums of curriculum and learning? Over scaffolding is another one. Like just providing, like creating these generations of dependent learners where learning isn't, they're not developing the critical thinking skills, problem-based problem solving skills that we need to survive and thrive and grow academically. And the other thing is, like, how are we allowing our students to engage with the curriculum? Are we giving them voice and choice and so forth? Discipline. Another big thing I mentioned earlier, when we're choosing to invest in police officers on our schools instead of mental health and wellness, when we look at the suspension rates for our students of color, expulsions, office referrals, and suspensions and office referrals for things like dress code violations or very subjective things like being disrespectful or defiant and disruptive and stuff like that. We see it in our best practices. So the way we instruct, the way we manage our classrooms, the policies, grading policies, homework policies, dress code policies, how we choose to assess our students. Are we, normally assessments are just there it is. There's just one way to assess. We don't give students the opportunity to demonstrate in multiple ways their knowledge or understanding of the curriculum. And one of the things, because I've heard it come up, it came up in a session that I attended through in this conference, was someone said that SEL is white supremacy with a hug. And one of the reasons why there's this big attack on white supremacy culture, and it's not just, I'm sorry, on SEL, and it's not just SEL, is that these programs, when they come in and we funnel them through the filter of white supremacy culture, it just becomes another tool to manage and reinforce compliancy under white supremacy culture to the norms of white supremacy. And it's causing harm. It's not helping our students thrive and grow and develop the cognitive capacities that they need to be successful in school and in life. And then if we look at the culture and climate, and this can be in the classroom or outside of the classroom, it's being weaponized in how we're communicating. Are we communicating in just English? What are the resources that we're providing? And this also connects to, like, are we providing health and wellness, counseling and support for our students and our community? What type of professional learning are we providing our teachers so that we can disrupt and dismantle systemic oppression and racism, both on the micro and macro levels? And then how are we engaging with our families? That's another way that we can see weaponized whiteness show up in school. And then again, under culture and climate is like, are we adopting this idea of colorblindness or the myth of meritocracy, grit? We need to teach our children grit. We need to teach or instill resilience. Our students are inherently, all of our students are inherent with resilience. If you know some of the stories or the impact or the barriers that students who are coming into our classrooms with, like, if we knew just a fraction of what's happening in their lives, you would see that resiliency is inherent in all of us. It's not something that we have to instill in our students of color. And then this other notion of assimilation. I'm here, I'm where I am today because of assimilation. And it was something that it came at a price. It came at a price of my culture, parts of my identity, relationships that I had in childhood, relationships that I had with my family. So all of these things that seem harmless, that seem neutral, are ways that whiteness can be weaponized and harm our students in education. So we're going to move into the next part, and I'm sorry if I'm going through kind of quickly. I want to give you some more time in a breakout space, but we want to talk a little bit about disrupting and dismantling systems of white supremacy in education. So this is our current reality. I'm not sure if you've seen this slide, this picture before, but we have we're expecting students to travel the same distance, but not taking into consideration all the barriers and obstacles and things that are put in front of them to get to that finish line. And having this notion, so it's a very colonized way of education. So through like you'll see it in like forced acquisition of whiteness, hegemonic ideals, expecting students of color to just forget or to just choose between their culture, their home language, and the language of school or the culture of school, which essentially, like I said earlier, is just, it's spirit murdering, it's culture murdering. And it's, yeah, it's harmful. So the thing that I just want to say is, how do we get to this place of decolonizing education systems and this decolonizing framework? So I've seen this image before, but I've always seen it with like the first two boxes, which deals with equality, equity, and then we get to the third box where we look at justice. And then the last one is liberation, because like that idea of, why does the fence need to be there in the first place? Why do the barriers need to be there in the first place? And how do we get to this place of education? So when we think about decolonizing education systems, we have to enter it into with a lens that everything is political. Education is political, and it's not neutrally political. It's very charged, and we must always isolate race and understand that our roles as educators have been historically problematic. I shared earlier that one of the most humanizing and just humbling things that I've come across in my career as an educator is accepting how I have upheld white supremacy culture through colorblind approach or assimilation, all of those ways that I thought, oh, this makes sense, but I was harming my students. And then asking ourselves, how might I see my role, curriculum, and space as things that are positioned within the historical context of racism, oppression, and control? And then once you identify those things, how can I then disrupt? How can I put myself in a position to disrupt those things? So one of the, so I highlighted 6 things that I feel are important when you're thinking about the path to decolonizing education. And the first thing is love, like critical love and compassion. So a commitment to love and care for the community and people within the community in which we work. This idea of humility, willingness to understand and accept the limits of our own worldviews, beliefs, and ideals. Critical reflection, so a deep dive into our intersectional identities and how they afford us privilege and marginalization. And then historical literacy, critical historical literacy, and just really understanding the awareness of the historical impact of the community in which we work. So not just the history that the big box curriculum would like us to share and perpetuate, but the true history. And that means becoming a historian, like critically questioning and researching everything and asking, how is this going to uplift and empower my students of color to see themselves in a positive way and to see the positive contributions that people that look like them have made to make this country great. And then the next one is positionality. I've heard it's shared as archaeology of self, and it's this critical analysis of how our identities shape our beliefs, biases, and ideals. And then the last thing is disruption. So again, how am I putting myself in a position or using my power in a way to disrupt racism and inequities at a personal and systemic level? And this is when we're going to have an opportunity. I'm going to stop my share so that we can come back to discuss in our breakout group our circles of action. So the name of this conference is ACT, so action changes things. And I would really like to give you an opportunity to think about, first of all, which area of action are you think you're ready to kind of engage in this work? So the personal circle it could be yourself, or maybe it's like your friends, your family, or your classroom. And then you have the community level. Sorry, let me go back to you have the community circle level. So like that could be at your school site or within your community. And then the next thing would be your world circle. So your world circle would be beyond the scope of your neighborhood or community. It would be, it could be like statewide or local government wise. So just taking a few moments, and I know that we're running short on time. So I'm wondering, just a thumbs up if we can do about 7 or 8 minutes to discuss and then come back, because I do want to save some time if we have some questions. Okay, so Rebecca, if you could open up the breakout spaces and we'll do about 8 minutes. And I see in the chat, I'm going to drop a link to the PDF at the end of the session, and it has all of the links and resources on there as well. See you guys in about 8 minutes. Welcome back. I apologize for the shortened time in the second breakout space, but I hope that you were able to have some conversation and discourse around the topic. And I'm going to invite you, as we did before, if you feel comfortable sharing what your circle of action will be, if it's personal, community, or world, if you pop that in the link, and then maybe like an action that you plan to engage in within that circle. And I'm going to share my screen again just to wrap us up before I open up for questions. And I will stay on a little bit after, because I know that Rebecca and I were just talking about how I wish we had more time to slow down and go through a little bit more in depth. Why is it?
So I also dropped the session evaluation link into the chat. So if you all could just take a moment and just click on that so that it's open.
I'm sorry, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, it got smaller. I think I clicked on one of the links in my presentation, so I apologize for that. So I just want to end with this quote from Ibram Kendi. He says that the heartbeat of racism is denial, and the heartbeat of anti-racism is confession. And I feel like this is a really critical understanding to kind of, or thing to kind of get curious about, especially with that new executive order that tells us that if you talk about racism or sexism, that we actually create it and make it happen as opposed to addressing it. So we're going to end with that quote and let it land where it lands for you. And then the last slide that I want to share, and again, like I said, everyone will put the link in the chat, is an additional resource slide. So I am still learning and growing in my social justice and anti-racism work. And I invite you all to just click on some of these links. I included an intersectionality identity worksheet if you want to look into your positionality or that archaeology of self that I discussed earlier. And then a few links with more information and resources that you can kind of check out and read at your own time. And that's in addition to the links and resources that are on each individual slide that will give you more information about terms and concepts that we discussed during this presentation. And lastly, just saying thank you once again for being here and sharing in this community with us today, and just my contact information, which will also be included in the slide deck that we pop into the chat. So I know we don't have much time, but I want to just like stick around if there are any questions or if anyone has a burning desire to share anything. I want to hold space for that. And Rebecca, were you able to share the slide deck, the link for the slide deck?
Yeah, I'm pulling that up right now.
Okay.
I have a question if no one else does. In our group, we were I guess I had kind of had the feeling that at times it's sort of frustrating that a lot of these trainings are filled with people of color who, of course, have the right intention and the right goal in kind of destroying this ideal. But I guess I'm trying to figure out the difference between disruption and then actually making a change, because to me it's like there's things that you can disrupt, but then there is teaching that is required to sort of change those minds that have just, you know, historically been in place for whatever reasons. And so I guess I'm just a little confused by that, and I feel like it's something that it feels like as a person of color, we are sort of charged to do. But I don't know if, I don't know. I don't know. I guess I'm just confused by this part. Sorry.
But I understand what you're asking, Brazil, I think, because I think you're saying the white people need to do the work. And that when you come to the trainings, you see a bunch of people of color who are already passionate about disrupting systems. And yet the people who are actually teaching the kids whose mindsets need to change are the ones who need the professional development around dismantling white supremacy. Is that your question?
Absolutely, Elizabeth.
Okay.
And Brazil, you did articulate it really comfortably in our session. I think there's more faces in the spaces, but when it was a small group, what you said in our small group meeting was exactly that.
And I understood it exactly that way too in this big group. I understood exactly what you meant, Brazil. I understood.
Yes, thank you for sharing that in this space. And I do see, I do understand your question and where you're coming from. And you're right, it's not our job as a person of color to hold this work. And it's not our job to educate other or like white people. And how can we create opportunities and how can we call out to pull in? And that's one of the resources that's linked into the PDF that I shared. We want to create these places that, yeah, we're calling out these systems and these issues, but we're calling them out to pull people in to help their unlearning. So we have a lot of unlearning to do. Even as people of color, we have a lot of unlearning to do. There are so many different ways that that we're perpetuating and upholding white supremacy culture that we have the work to do as well. And then any way that we can to just offer opportunities for people to step in and to do the work with us. We're not leading the work. We're just giving them the opportunity, the invitation to do this work alongside of us. So I think that's the other thing.
I'm sorry. It just seems like such a prime example of privilege that there's an option, you know? So anyway.
That's one of the things in
it, but I really do feel like that. I think that it's really unfortunate. And I understand the movements and I get, you know, making those small moments. I know I've worked with my son's school for an equity, you know, program that pulled in, you know, a lot of other, or not just other, but definitely white faces and families. And it definitely has made a change. But again, even that is something that what I found in working with that is that it's something that people either want to do or they don't. And if they don't, they're going to continue, you know, doing it. So I mean, I appreciate the people that are stepping up and are taking those, you know, leads. I just wish that there was maybe some kind of a connection with those people that then we can figure out how to reach the others, you know?
And a lot of what I heard you say is that and that's in the invisible backpack. And there's like, I put a link in there too, when it's called Unpacking the Invisible Backpack of White Privilege. White people have the option of opting out of conversations and work around race. People of color, we don't have that option. We're having these conversations with our students or our children at very, very young ages. because they cannot. And I always say, like, when I share my story, and I apologize that I wasn't able to share a lot of my own personal story because like there was so much. I wish we had more time. But when I share my story, like part of my assimilation was changing or getting rid of or killing off any characteristics about myself other than my skin color and my gender, which I could not change, that othered me, right? And even then, like with my assimilation, it was a provisional membership to the club. I still had limits. I still had barriers. And even though I checked all the boxes, I did everything right. And I did so for myself, but also for my child. It wasn't enough to protect my own child from experiencing racism and oppression in schools. So it's just like, there are just so many, I hear the frustration of just not, of having that option of just saying, nope, this is something that I'm not going to do because, you know, it's not me. And on the other hand, we have our children and people of color who don't have that option. It's very frustrating. It's a very frustrating work.
I had a question, if I may just add. Our district, our small district in East Palo Alto has been working on this like for a couple of years, anti-racist work, because we have seen so much. Our kids are just being, shipped away to prisons. I mean, school to prison in a pipeline. There are no appropriate mental health, services for them in the community. But what I, came across as a PBIS coordinator trying to disrupt the system is our teachers have more rights than our students, and especially, teachers who are tenured. It's almost impossible to change or get rid of them, and that's been my battle. I just don't know how to go around that. How do we dismantle, that part?
Can we pause the recording? Because it's actually time for that. It's done.